Hello again, everyone. All right, so we're going to start this week's lectures. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Throughout the semester, I'm going to do different kinds of presentations. So I'll use several different Prezi templates and on that website and that resource. And then I'll also use several different kind of formatting options on PowerPoint. That way you get a wider variety of examples. And I will walk you through how to make like one of each towards the end of the semester when we get closer to that project, okay? But I do wanted to let you know that. So let's go ahead and share my screen. All right, so this is going to be an example of one of the Prezis I'm going to do. I'm going to walk you through what we're going to do in these next couple of presentations. All right, so we're going to go ahead, and this one's going to be specifically about refreshing some of those things from intro, some of those things, some of those sociological concepts that we'll be using throughout the semester that we need to like just touch base with again to make sure we kind of understand. Then we're going to go into this week's reading. So we'll go into the five sexes revisited, brain scams, doing gender, which is probably the most influential one we'll touch on. So if that video is a little over 5, that might be why. And then we'll go into kind of the 2 other optional readings. And in that one, make sure you go ahead and at least watch the video or listen to the video, because at the end, I'm going to touch base on the assignments that are due for this module. So that way we kind of have a plan laid out. All right, so here we go. Okay, so again, we're going to go into kind of some sociological thinking. We're going to talk about how we understand gender as a social construct, and then we're going to talk a little bit about critical reading, because I think these are the key things that we need to really hone in on for this semester. So let's talk about sociological thinking. As sociologists, we aim to understand the context of any kind of concept, right? So in this class particularly, we're going to be talking about gender and how the context throughout historical periods, the context throughout social settings, the context between different kind of institutions, how that context and that framework changes depending on where we are at and what exactly we're looking at and why that's important, okay? As sociologists, we apply theory. So we're going to learn a lot about theory in these first couple of weeks, and then we're going to get into how this plays out in real institutions or real bigger networking things. So things like work, things like the family, things like situations like that. But for the first bit, we're going to understand how we look at gender, what gender is, how it's maintained, how it's reinforced, all of those kind of concepts. And we do that through understanding the theories we have as sociologists and outside of sociologists that we use as sociologists to look at gender, okay? We're going to also understand that as sociologists, we critically review. We critically review both our understanding that research changes as we grow more understandings, as we grow and look at more context, as we grow as sociology and as the field in general, and just more broadly as the field of gender researchers, right? And so when we look at things, especially when we look at some of our older sociological texts, we're going to see those things like the 5 sexes revisited. We're going to see doing gender and how it's applied and built on and or reflected on and critically kind of analyzed in ways that it's not so much that it's saying that that's false, but understanding that there's contextual understandings to it, right? There's more. And that's kind of what we want to do with critical review. On the flip side of that, we also want to understand that as we go through, there are still very much like sociological frameworks that don't work anymore, right? That more theory, that more research has done to work through and understand, which we'll touch into kind of when we get into brain scans, how our understanding that gender was specifically genetic, specifically built in, that was permanent, may not be the case and isn't the case. And that way we can kind of walk through how critically reviewing these things builds our scientific method, right? We're also going to look at things from a microcosm or a micro perspective and a macro. So we're going to look at the big and the macro. We're going to look at those institutions, but we're also going to look at the micro. How do these interact with interpersonal relations, with our understandings of self, with our understandings of how we walk very, very specific situations, these things. So we're going to look at it from multiple perspectives, right? Because that's how we do things as social scientists and understanding how those things interact. We're going to, on that same note, we're going to talk about how things are in an interpersonal, an institution, or a systemic way. And again, these are terms that you should have from intro. However, I can also throw up a definitions page if we're still struggling with some of these. But we're looking at interpersonal as those interactions between two people, generally in some kind of social setting, like how you interact with a family member, how you interact with a friend, how you interact with a boss, how you interact with, right? It's a more one-on-one situation or a very one-to-group situation, small group situation, right? It's not a big, huge social dynamic. Institutional, looking at how you interact with an entire, or like how a concept interacts with an entire governing body of some sort. So like either we're looking at institutions as, say, work as an institution, schools as an institution, government as an institution, family as an institution, right? These big, big things that impact and shape who we are, what we are, how we do what we do. And then looking at systemic, how are the things that we write into laws, how do these then trickle down into influencing the institutional level, the interpersonal level, this is like the society as a whole, right? So we're going to work through some of those things, okay? And then we're going to talk about how we understand gender, what gender is, and how it impacts us and the social world at large, right? We gender so many things. And so it's so pivotal to understand how that social world is getting shaped and how they are shaping these concepts, right? All right. So this is one of the key things we need to hone in on as we move forward in this class. This is one of the biggest parts of this entire thing. And if you learn nothing else from this class, understand this, right? Gender is a social construct. Okay, and what I mean by that is that there's a difference between something that is innate, that's something that is permanent, something is fixed, something that is unmoved and unchanged, right? Gender has changed in how we shape gender and what we define as male, female, non-binary. All of those things depend on the social context you're in, depend on the cultural context you're in, depend on the historical time period, depend on this. And we will get into this so many times throughout the semester, but it's very important to understand the difference. It's also very important to understand the difference between sex and gender. Sex is a biological construct, right? It is something that we measure, rank by essentially chromosome, hormone levels, physical anatomy. This is kind of in chromosomal gene-based things. Now, there are multiple variations in that, and even that in of itself can have some social context to it, but that is a much more theoretical conversation, and it is something that we'll get into further when we talk about brain scans. But the point I want to get at when I talk about that is that sex is more talking about the biological things, the physical anatomy, these kinds of situations, and gender is more talking about the expression of how you embody your world, right? So how you present yourself to the world, how the world reads you. This is more how we understand gender and how those things are shaped based on the cultural context that they are surrounded in, right? And we want to talk about how this changes. Again, sex also has multiple variations, and we will talk about those as we get into some of the brain scans and the 5 sexes revisited, okay? But I want to make sure that that's mentioned. Changes in time and space. Okay, so like, think about this. There are periods in time where men dressing in big royal robes that were flowy and looked more what we would consider in America at this point as effeminate would be considered very manly, very regal, very this, right? When we look at the differences between what colors were used to express specific genders, that changes even in cultural context now. When you look at geography and the different cultural contexts, right? Men in kilts in other countries are looked at as incredibly masculine. If they wore those consistently here, they would have and face social sanctions as not being manly enough, right? So we need to kind of talk about how these things are shaped through time and space and how they change and how they operate. And we will do that as we talk through the semester. We also want to talk about how we gender things that don't have a sex or gender, right? We gender inanimate objects, we gender spaces, we gender colors, we gender jobs, we gender like roles within society, we gender labor, we gender all sorts of things. And we're going to talk about that again more as we get into the situation, right? We're going to talk about that more as we progress into the semester. Lastly, I want to kind of just briefly touch on how to critically read. When you critically read and you find all these journal articles and they're starting to get a little overwhelming, right? Understand that reading every word or every part of a journal article is not necessarily going to help you at every capacity because it depends on what you're looking for. If you're going in and analyzing how somebody's doing each one of these research projects, then you're going to want to look at the methods section, right? When you look at the textbook, you'll notice that these versions of the articles are actually generally much smaller than the articles if you go and get them online at the library. The reason for that is that they've cut out some of the things that are important in context if you're looking at how the studies are done or how the theory got created, but not when you're looking at to the point, this is the information I need from it. And so as you move forward and as you get some of the pieces that do have all of it, make sure you're paying attention to the sections you really need to hammer in on and paying very close attention to that. You can still touch on the other ones, but skim read them, right? We all know how to kind of pretend that we read certain sections and pull out some things so that we know kind of at least can think we know what we're talking about, right? Do some of that in the sections that are not necessary, but make sure if you're looking at things, the finding sections and the discussion are probably the most important part. They will also probably mention some of the things in the introduction that will at least get you to where you need to be. And if it's something that you don't know a lot about, I would bargain that you need to probably read some of the introduction too, so that you can kind of get a framework for how they're using. And it also will give you a crap ton of sources that you can cite or go find later if you want to write about that topic, right? It helps you find those sources, that introduction. So if you're looking for more sources, look for them there so you can read exactly, you know, what they're saying they are mainly about, and you can pull out the ones you need. Make sure you get your main points. Make sure you can find the thesis. Find the thesis. Most of the time it's in the abstract, but also it'll show up again towards the end of the introduction or towards the beginning of going into the next bit. You need to find out what it's trying to say, what its point is. And that will help you. Theory pieces are a little different. They're going to have probably multiple points. Make sure that you're looking as they start a section and you're reading the parts that they start so that you know exactly what it is they're trying to say, because those main points are what you're trying to pull out of the article. And if you were going to cite them in something else, those are the things that you're going to want to get, right? That's like the where you see the introduction and they've done that with a whole bunch of other people. If you're going to cite this one, you want to be able to pull out those points to cite in your essentially introduction or lit review, correct? Right? So this is what we're trying to get at. There is a big difference between a theory piece and a research findings piece. The research finding is essentially testing those theory pieces, right? And those theory pieces are going to have evidence within them more than likely. And those evidence are going to be based on, are going to be critical in understanding the theory and what they're trying to say as well. But testing them within the context and the bigger sociological picture that we have is going to be done more in a research findings paper. And those are going to be things that you can find to kind of balance each other out. As you go into your 5 sources or when you go into looking at sources for your bigger projects, you need to have a little bit of both. You need to know how you're framing things with your theory piece and then find that evidence, right? That has already used that theory piece and or can back up what the theory is saying. And this will be helpful, and we'll talk more about this as we go through. Again, remember that we're talking about critically reviewing these readings. No research is perfect. We are inherently built with our own social context and our own social, we have gone through our own specific life stories and life histories and personal backgrounds. And those shape and influence how we research, how we read, how we review things, how we write, how we speak. Those things do come out in research. That's not always a bad thing, right? If you are looking at something that is very personal to you from a personal lens, that can create a different kind of research. You can look at a social action lens. Hey, this thing has personally affected me. I want to make change. This is what I'm going through that. But understanding that that's the lens it's going through is part of being a critical reader and part of understanding. And you're also going to want to look for things like biases. Is this an institution that has funded this, or an institution that is doing research to specifically garner funding, garner possibly a better hierarchical status within the context that they want to be in? Understand that those biases are there. Understand that the inherent biases that we have based on our social context are also there. That the age of the article can have a lot to do with it. Science progresses. If it's from an incredibly old, we read a lot of critical theory from Marx, from Durkheim, from Weber. When we read those, we understand that they've had to grow, they've had to adapt, they've had to come into the context, and people have used those in specific ways in order to grow those, or to shape them, or to frame them in ways that are now more pertinent. There's still main ideas that can be explored. That doesn't mean that everything that they said is gold at this point, right? And that's part of understanding that research builds, has to shape, has to keep continuing. And that will be the same for everything that you learn in college. So that age plays a part in it. We need to understand that. Language changes, especially when we talk about gender, especially when we talk about social change. That is something that we will talk about a lot in this class, because it's something that I will note in your content warnings, because those things matter. Those things especially matter to those who consistently are hierarchically structured at a lesser end and face many oppressions. Understand that if you're going to go through this, read for the purpose. What is their purpose? What is their audience? What is their methods? What is their main point? These are the things you need to get out. Purpose, main point, methods, audience. If you can garner those 4 things from what you have read, then you can take that information and know what to do with it. Okay, so we're going to work on that as we move through the course. And so that's kind of just our general review. This is the things that we need to touch base on as we move forward and go into some of these readings. And now we're going to do that. So I hope you have a great day, and I will talk again soon.